Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you happen to be listening to this. So this is chapter 15. So we are talking Civil War. This might be a little longer than the
Well,
others.
there's
So
several important
1861 to
turning points during the Civil
1865.
War militarily.
So we are going to start
Perhaps the
off
most
with our
dramatic
textbook friend.
occurred on July 4th, 1863, when Union forces won the Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania at the same time that the Confederate Army in besieged Vicksburg, Mississippi, also surrendered. Two great Union victories on the same day. Unfortunately, however, in the case of Gettysburg, the Union Army did not follow up and pursue the retreating Confederate Army that was headed back to Virginia. It could have perhaps ended the war had it done so. As a result, even though it was a major disaster for the Confederacy, the Union decisions allowed the Confederacy to regroup and rearm and continue fighting. So the next major turning point was placing Ulysses S. Grant in charge of the entire Union military effort. Grant had a very different style and personality than his predecessors, and Grant decided that the only way to end the war was to pursue the Confederate Army relentlessly, regardless of the cost, regardless of the casualties, but to force an end to the war. And that's what he did, taking a year and a half of ferocious fighting from the middle of 1864 through the spring of 1865 when the war ended. So Grant was a strategic turning point himself.
From the middle of 1864 through the spring of 1865 when the war ended. So Grant was a strategic turning point himself.
Interesting stuff. All right, so buckle down, kids. This is bound to be a long one. All right, so the causes of the war. So the reasons are given for the South seceding are as varied as the soldiers who fought in the conflict. You'll talk to a lot of historians who will say it was strictly slavery. You talk to them who'll say it's strictly states' rights. More likely it's a combination of. But since it's history, we'll just never know the real truth. So many in the South are going to view it as a reaction necessary to protect their states' rights, as guaranteed under the Constitution. Others argued that it was due to the tariffs that fell disproportionately on the South. Actions by the leaders of the Confederacy often spoke to the heart of the matter. That was truly the issue of secession, was the South's desire to retain slaves and to take them into new territories. Excuse me, I got the sniffles. But no matter how you look at it, a lot of people continued believed the ability to keep slaves to be a state's right as well. Lincoln would never request a declaration of war from Congress. Following Fort Sumter, he would order a blockade of the southern coast. This later would be ruled by the Supreme Court to have the same effect as a declaration of war. Once Lincoln issued the order, 4 more states seceded: Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Arkansas. Delaware, although a slave state, remained in the Union, and Maryland, also a slave state, was forced by federal troops to remain in the Union. Those become your border states in the North that have slavery. The western portion of Virginia is going to secede from the state. It is admitted to the Union as West Virginia. So if you ever wondered where West Virginia came from or why Virginia was originally so large, this is what happens. Missouri and Kentucky are also going to remain in the Union. Again, both are slave states. So these are going to be your northern border states. Robert E. Lee of Virginia, he was asked to lead the Federal Army against the forces of the Confederacy. He refused, stating that his state came before the Union. So although the majority of the Southerners fought for the Confederacy, over 100,000 soldiers who fought for the Union were Southerners by birth. Civil War is one of those wars you have brother against brother, father against son, uncle against nephew, that kind of stuff. So a lot of families were split and forced to take sides as well. All right. So this right here, this is going to be your secessions. So if you recall, South Carolina is the first one, December 20th, 1860. And this occurs 1 month after Lincoln is elected. Directly after that, you have Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida that are all going to have seceded by February of 1861. Again, this is before Lincoln takes office because he doesn't get inaugurated until March 4th in 1861. Your Confederate border states are going to be Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. And those seceded a little later. In 1861, April and May, so after Lincoln takes office. Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. These are all slave states in the Union. All right. So as we've seen over the past chapters and stuff, the North is easily going to outnumber the South when it comes to manufacturing, because that's how they made their money, is manufacturing. The South makes it through agriculture, the North makes it through manufacturing. The South is still overwhelmingly agrarian, of course. The North also outnumbers the South in total population by almost 5 to 1. At the beginning of the war, the Confederacy fought a defensive war, and this would call for fewer supplies and soldiers, which benefited their cause greatly, meaning they only fought if somebody came their way. They weren't attacking at the beginning. When you look at it today, there's really no reason to have believed the South ever had a chance to win. But they do get some opportunity to kind of advance on the North at some points. But for the most, it's a stalemate for a while, which is why this war lasts so long. All right. So the North and the South, they have different names for a lot of the battles. So you'll have the Battle of Manassas or the Battle of Bull Run. The North is going to name them after geographical features, while the South is going to name them after nearby towns. So at the Battle of Bull Run, the Federal forces are going to be defeated, but the exhausted Confederates do not give chase. The battle gave the lie to the conventional wisdom at the time that the war would be over in one decisive victory for either side. So they're basically thinking this isn't going to take long. We're going to win one battle. Everybody's going to come back together. After the Battle of Bull Run, Lincoln's going to adopt a strategy to launch a 3-pronged assault on the South. He's going to divide it and then defeat each section. The South hopes to win enough defensive battles to secure recognition from a foreign government to apply to the North to grant its independence. So essentially, if you look at it that way, if you look at it from the South's position, they are fighting to win independence from the aggressor nation, which is going to be the United States of America, in their opinion. So depending on the point of view, you could also consider it not only a civil war, but also a war for independence, which was lost. All right. So how do you become an independent country? You have to have foreign recognition. And that is vital to Confederate interests if the Confederates hope to survive. Much like the rebellious colonies had courted France a century before, so remember the United States, when they were rebelling from Great Britain, tried to get France to help them out. The rebels also hoped to secure French recognition. France agrees, however, as long as Great Britain would follow suit. But under pressure of the United States, Great Britain is not going to do that. They'll help out the South. They'll give them some money. They'll buy stuff from them. But they're not going to recognize them as a country because of their relationship with the northern states. The Federal Congress would at first rely on recruits to field the armies. Confederacy is also going to rely on recruits. But by 1862, it started an involuntary draft, and in 1863, the Union would follow suit. So these are the first drafts in the United States. Is during the Civil War. And they would draft from 18 to 35, and eventually they had to put it up to 45 to get enough men. From the beginning, many blacks believed the war was about freeing them from servitude. As a result, many plantation owners found their slaves listless, hard to drive, and doing very little after they'd been motivated by the war. Some would volunteer to help their masters while at war for the Confederacy, while others would serve as spies for the Union. Also, you must note that during these drafts, if you were a rich white male, you had opportunity to get out of fighting. If you were a slave owner, you could provide 20 slaves to fight on your behalf. Or you could send somebody in your place. In the North, you could pay a fee. So there was ways for rich white men to get out of serving in the Civil War. While the North and the South are going to war, the West is being rapidly populated. During the war, you have Idaho, Nevada, Arizona, and Montana who are going to be added to the Union. And the new areas are going to require federal troops for protection and would draw men and supplies from the war effort back east. So that's one of the things the Union is dealing with, is the expansion of the country at the same time. All right. This is the Army Recruiting Office in City Hall Park, New York City. The sign advertises that money offered to those willing to serve. So $677 to new recruits, $777 to veteran soldiers, and $15 to anyone who brought in a recruit. A finder's fee, if you will, a referral fee. Refer you to the Army. All right. So you have two theaters of the Civil War. First, you've got the area east of the Appalachian Mountains, and second, the area west of that range. So in the Western Theater, you have Confederate General Albert S. Johnson. He's defeated by Union General Ulysses S. Grant when Grant takes Fort Henry and Donelson in February of 1862. The war's been going on about a year at this point. The Confederate forces regroup from these defeats as Grant pursues them. At Shiloh, on the Tennessee-Mississippi border, Johnson attacks Grant's forces and nearly defeats them. But then Johnson was killed and his forces fell into disarray. Grant would counterattack the next day and the rebel forces would withdraw. So we win that battle. Alright. So these are going to be campaigns in the West from February to April of 1862. Your purple is going to be your Confederates. That's a new one. Usually you see them as red. Your blue is going to be your Union advances. The little red stars are going to be your battles. And then you can see the railroad lines in green. So you can see how the Union troops did a lot of their traveling is by river, by railroad tracks, that kind of stuff. All right. After the debacle at Bull Run, Lincoln is going to replace the commanding General Irvin McDowell with General George McClellan. McClellan proved an excellent organizer and strategist, but was horrible at implementation. He planned an amphibious landing on the peninsula of Virginia, and this is exactly where Cornwallis had been defeated in the Revolution. And he marched west to the Confederate capital of Richmond. He dawdled until March of 1862, and then when he landed, was within 60 miles of his goal. Lee takes command of the rebel forces and defends the capital. An argument between Lincoln and McClellan would see the general removed and Henry Halleck put back into command. So Lincoln was very involved in who was in charge of the battles and that kind of stuff. He would replace people and whatnot. Lee is going to attack the Union forces before Halleck and his troops could arrive, once again in the vicinity of the Bull Run River. So this is going to be your second Battle of Bull Run, or second Manassas. The Confederate victory was so great that the Union Army was driven back to Washington, D.C., where Lincoln had no choice but to reinstate McClellan. So these are some of your Union soldiers. They're sharing a moment of rest. And you can see this is a photograph as to where this is a point in time. We're going to actually start getting a lot of photographs of the events and activities that are going on. This is one of the first times that we have photographed war while it's going on. So you can see a lot of images still today that are pictures of the Civil War while it's going on. Dead bodies on fields and troops in camps and things like that. All right. This is your Peninsular Campaign in 1862. You have your Confederate advances coming across land. You have McClellan coming down the river from March to May. It takes him a long time, basically kind of dilly-dallying to get there. So maybe if he'd sped up his business, he'd have been more successful. Who knows? Life will only tell us later. All right. So the South's victories in the early part of the war are going to dampen the spirits of those in the North and the slaves in the South. As land in the South is captured by the Union, though, the federal forces face a new problem. What do we do with these newly liberated slaves? So by 1862, Lincoln is openly talking with his cabinet about a permanent solution to the slave issue. The victorious Lee would change the format of the war by invading the Union. Because remember, like I said originally, they were just kind of defending themselves. So Lee's going to turn it about. He's going to invade the Union. Lee's plan was to win a momentous victory in the Union and thus secure foreign recognition. His strategy was discovered when a package of cigars wrapped with his orders was discovered by Union soldiers. They were given to McClellan. The general does not act on them immediately. Finally acting, McClellan engages Lee at the Antietam Creek near the town of Sharpsburg, Maryland. The result was the bloodiest day of the war, in which the only way the Union forces could claim a victory was that Lee was forced to retreat back into the Confederacy. So this is the battle that was playing at the beginning of the film, the Battle of Antietam. And not only was it the bloodiest day of the war, it is the bloodiest day of any war in our history. I don't know if that includes wars that were fought on foreign lands, but definitely here in the United States. Because it was not the stunning defeat for the Confederacy that Lincoln wanted, he permanently reassigns McClellan to recruiting duty. He doesn't trust him to fight, but he'll trust him to go get new members. New peeps to fight. Alright, this is Lincoln right there. You can see him sitting at the table on the left. And this is George B. McClellan, who are going to confer at Antietam on October 4th, 1862. I think this is after the fact. So, all right. I don't know. Does your book mention what they do with many of the slaves? They actually, as they free them, they have them join the army. They're called contrabands. And they do mostly manual labor. So at the film, when they run into the other black regiment, they're called contrabands. That's what they are. Is they're black slaves that were freed by the Union Army. So, all right. So Lincoln promised in his inauguration address to protect slavery where it existed. So once slave lands were taken by federal soldiers, the chief issue becomes what to do with the slaves that had been captured. So with one bold movement, Lincoln is able to turn the war into a war of liberation for the slaves, so that foreign recognition would be denied the Confederacy. So France and England had abolished it years prior, and to encourage those enslaved in the Confederacy to be less willing to help their masters. So they could see as the Union was coming that people were getting freed. And that's kind of a loose term. They're free as long as the Union's winning, but if at some point the Union was not winning again, those men would not have remained free. You have the Emancipation Proclamation, which we have talked about. It does not extend to any Confederate lands that at the time that were held by Union forces. So Emancipation Proclamation essentially does not free anybody. We talked about that yesterday. But still, many slaves in those areas are going to proclaim their freedom anyway. You have the great abolitionist leader Frederick Douglass is going to be overjoyed at Lincoln's action, which is no action. It's a political move. All right, but moving on. Here are your contrabands. So former slaves on a farm in Cumberland Landing, Virginia of 1862. All right, so this is two views of the Emancipation Proclamation. So you have the Union view, which is going to show a thoughtful Lincoln composing the proclamation with the Constitution and the Holy Bible in his lap. And you have the Confederate view, which shows a demented Lincoln, his foot on the Constitution and his inkwell held by the devil. So, interesting. All right. So after Antietam, Antietam's going to prove to be the turning point of the war. This is what encourages Lincoln to give the Emancipation Proclamation. The Union, which had yet to experience a victory, does claim one in Antietam. Lincoln, who'd been waiting for such an event, again, like I said, issues the Emancipation Proclamation, which would free all slaves in Confederate states. The proclamation destroys any chance the South had at foreign recognition. Let's see. To lead the Federal Army, Lincoln places General Ambrose Burnside in command. He pursues Lee to the town of Fredericksburg in Virginia, where he suffers twice the casualties of the well-entrenched rebels. So, despite the fact that the Union has no reason to lose, they lose a lot of men. A lot of men. They lose a lot of battles initially. So, All right, campaigns in Virginia and Maryland, 1862. Again, the purple is your Confederates, the blue is the Unions, and the red is your battle sites. All right, African Americans in the North are going to be organized into all-black military units to be led by white officers. As a result, the war continues to change from one to preserve the Union to a war of liberation for the millions enslaved in the South. By the end of the Civil War, 10% of all enlisted men were African American. Just remember always, Lincoln never started this war to set the slaves free. He didn't really, frankly, care. He didn't want to add new slavery, but he was okay with preserving it where it was. He really was more invested in preserving the Union. And I think he comes to find out that he cannot preserve the Union without some sort of emancipation. All right. This is a black Union Army sergeant. He's wearing his uniform and sword. He poses with a copy of J.T. Headley's The Great Rebellion in his hand. Very proud looking. All right. So women in the North, over 20,000 women served as nurses or other health-related volunteers during the war. On both sides, departure of so many men requires women to take part in spheres usually dominated by men. Both sides in the Civil War believed they were fighting a holy war to ensure God's favor. Each side provides chaplains to soldiers, and many camps held their own religious revivals. Remember, this is a very religious Christian country in the 1800s. This is Clara Barton. She oversaw the distribution of medicines to Union troops. She later helps found the American Red Cross, of which she remains president until the age of 83. So, all right. So, how do we finance the war? So, in order to finance the war, the Union is going to tax, borrow, and print more money. In 1862, Congress passes the first ever income tax. The Confederacy is going to institute a tax on property, but relies on the individual states to collect it. By 1863, the government had placed taxes on everything. It would print money, but it has no control over it. Inflation is very high. They kind of just printed what they needed without any kind of thought of the economic consequences. With the majority of the Democrats having left Congress, Lincoln finds himself battling a group of radical Republicans who are going to argue for drastic changes to the South. It is designed to punish it for its actions. What Democrats remained pursued a policy of returning the Union to its pre-war status. You have Southern sympathizers such as the Copperheads. Remember, that's a poisonous snake. Compels Lincoln to arrest over 14,000 of them. And in one instance, he banishes one of them to the Confederacy. 1864, the Democrats nominate General McClellan for president. Lincoln secures a Republican nomination for another term. He chooses Andrew Johnson, a Democrat from Tennessee, who had refused to relinquish his seat when his state seceded, to be his vice president. The election looked bad for Lincoln until victories by Admiral David Farragut and General William Tecumseh Sherman turned this tide. Blah, blah, blah. Lincoln is reelected by a landslide. So, since the Union was winning at that point, that's why people voted for Lincoln. In the Confederacy, you have the executive branch enjoyed a 6-year term. So neither Jefferson Davis nor his vice president, Alexander Stephens, had to run again during the course of the war. Excuse me. Davis's biggest challenge comes from those arch secessionists who, once their state had left the Union, refused to give much support to the new Confederate government. We don't like the old government. We don't like the new government. We just won't support nobody. This is Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy. All right. Following Burnside's removal after a Fredericksburg debacle, General Joseph Hooker was placed in command. Lee engaged Hooker's forces at Chancellorsville, Virginia, and defeats them, even though Lee was outnumbered. At this battle, Lee's most dedicated and trusted general, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, was accidentally shot by his own men. He lost his left arm, he developed pneumonia, and died. So, Stonewall Jackson. In the Western Theater, Grant is trying to secure the city of Vicksburg. This is Mississippi. It occupies a strategic bend in the Mississippi River. So by capturing it, he cuts the South in half, because whoever controlled Vicksburg controlled the river. He launched a daring overland campaign against the city, places it under siege. This is another thing that really turns the tide of the war. This is Thomas Stonewall Jackson, mortally wounded by his own men. Yay, Jackson. Alright. Battle of Gettysburg. So, in an attempt to pull forces from Vicksburg and turn Northerners against the war, Lee decides to invade Pennsylvania. The two armies meet at Gettysburg, and they wage the decisive battle of the war on July 1st through 3rd, 1863. Trying to take the high ground from the Yankees, Lee orders General Pickett to charge them and secure it. The charge crossed a vast quantity of open terrain, and Pickett's troops were easily picked off. Lee withdrew from the north, never to invade again. This is the last time that the Confederates invaded the Union. At the dedication of a national cemetery at Gettysburg, Lincoln delivered his greatest speech ever. Of course, the Gettysburg Address. Alright. This is the dead at Gettysburg. This is a photograph done by Timothy H. O'Sullivan. He did a lot of Civil War photography. Again, these are your battles. This is all in your book, so you can feel free to look at them. Alright. So, what kind of difficulties do the Confederates have? So, at the Battle of Chattanooga, Lincoln finds his general. So, Grant turns a Federal near route into a stunning victory for the Yankees when he takes command of the army there from General William Rosecrans. Lincoln promotes Grant to lieutenant general and makes him general-in-chief of all Federal forces. Big promotion for Ulysses there. Using the Union's superiority in both manpower and war material, Grant plans a strategy to constantly attack Lee's forces and wear them down by attrition. At the Battle of the Wilderness outside Chancellorsville, Grant engages Lee's forces and continues to attack. Whereas previous generals had retreated after suffering such tremendous casualties, ultimately Lee retreated to Petersburg, where Grant placed the rebel forces under siege. So. Alright, let's see what else we got here. This is Ulysses S. Grant at his headquarters in City Point, which is now Hopewell, Virginia. Nice little chair there. Alright. When Grant leaves the Western Theater, he turns control of those forces over to General William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman marches southeast from Tennessee toward Atlanta, destroying everything in his way. Confederate forces are unable to defeat him, and Davis replaced his generals in an effort to find someone who could. Sherman's intent was to destroy the South's ability to wage war by attacking the people and devastating the farm and their crops. So he's moved past just fighting the soldiers. He is now destroying things. These are Union soldiers marching through Virginia in 1864. This is the tattered colors of the 56th and 36th Massachusetts regiments. I don't know if your book doesn't talk about it, but the 54th in Massachusetts, which we watched the film Glory on, their first battle that they fight happens at the same time as Gettysburg does, and the other one's just a few days later. And as you saw at the end of the film, they never won. They never got that fort during the war, but it is definitely something that puts Black Union soldiers on the map. All right. Grant, Virginia, more battles. This is our friend William Tecumseh Sherman. His campaign develops into a war of maneuver, but without the pitched battles of Grant's campaign. These are Sherman's campaign, and Sherman just kind of went through and destroyed everything in his path. Which is really going to cause a big problem, because he's not just dealing with soldiers at that point. I mean, he's going to big cities where people live. Okay, fleeing Petersburg in the spring of 1865, Lee tries to escape Grant's pursuing forces. He finds himself cut off from escape, and he really has no choice but to surrender to Grant. So he surrenders the courthouse at Appomattox. Civil War is the first modern war. From the introduction of armored ships to that of the rifled cannon, the war is going to set the stage for future world wars. So, which only happened, 60 years later, 50 years later? So, anyway, that is chapter 15. That is our information on the Civil War. I know it's very exciting. I hope you have a fabulous Thanksgiving if you're listening to this before then. Hopefully you are, if you've done your work on time. And I will see you soon. Have a good morning, afternoon, or evening.